Conquest of New Spain, Bernal Díaz, translated and introduced by J.M. Cohen, London, the Follovio Society. Introduction. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the last survivor of the conquerors of Mexico, died on his estates in Guatemala at the age of 89, as poor as he had lived. Born in 1492, the year in which Columbus discovered the New World, he survived to see a great part of America subjugated by Spain. But despite the leading role he had played in the heroic overthrow of the Aztec Empire, he left his family no other riches than his true and wonderful history of the conquest of New Spain, of which he made his fair copy at the age of 76. When he was, according to his own certainly exaggerated description, both deaf and blind, and to which he had added his preliminary note at the age of 84. He had been over 70 when he began it, and had at one point given it up. For on one comparing the finest style of certain other chroniclers who had told the story of Cortez's achievements with less first-hand knowledge than he had, with the roughness and lack of polish of his own language, he had been discouraged. Certainly, Bernal Díaz was not an accomplished stylist. He had, however, a graphic memory and a great sense for the dramatic. Moreover, he was conscious of having taken part in a great achievement, unparalleled in modern history, the overthrow of a great empire by a company of adventurers, inspired partly by a sense of mission and partly by a cruel greed for gold. Their success, even their survival, could, in his belief, be accounted for only by the miraculous intervention of God and the saints, who wished New Spain to be added to the realm of Christ and the Emperor Charles V. So, when Bernal Díaz found the story misrepresented by Cortez's chaplain, an official panegyrist, So when Bernal Díaz found the story misrepresented by Cortez's chaplain and official panegyrist Francisco López de Gomara, and also by Gonzalo de Ilsicas, who spoke the truth neither in the beginning nor the middle nor the end, he decided to resume his work and carry it to completion. Many times in the course of his history, he refers to these chroniclers settling. Many times in the course of his history, he refers to these chroniclers setting right their errors and often angrily accusing them of ignorance and malice. His purpose was by no means simply to vindicate his own part in the march on Mexico. True, he frequently informs the readers that Cortez consulted his captains and soldiers, including himself, at important junctures in the campaign, and did not, as Gomara asserted, make all his decisions alone. Bernal Díaz, however, never attempts to claim a bigger role for himself than for his fellows, and for long passages of his narrative he describes an event at which he was not present, sometimes because of wounds, or in which his part is indicated only by the use of we or of us soldiers. Were the, where the stay-at-home historian would have had to write a plain the. The narrative here translated covers the two preliminary explorations of the Mexican coast under Cordoba and Girjalva, with both of whom Bernal Díaz served. The first march of Montezuma's city, the Spaniards' expulsion and flight, and their subsequent build-up of a new army, with which they had captured the island capital of the empire, which Guatemoc had now inherited from Montezuma. Bernal Díaz's history, however, is a much longer book than this. It covers the long tales of intrigue in Spain, Cuba, and Hispaniola, which almost succeeded in replacing Cortes by weaker leaders who would have been content to make a few modest settlements on the coast. And it continues after the final reduction of the Mexican capital to tell of further campaigns in search of the gold which had so far evaded the conquerors. Bernal Díaz describes also the terrible march through the forest of Honduras, Cortes's final prosperity, and his own efforts on a visit to Spain to secure some better fortune for himself, the oldest conquistador of New Spain, than what came to him from his estates and his majesty in Guatemala. By his own confession, as we saw, Bernal Díaz was a poor stylist, and a retranslation of his whole narrative would have filled almost 2 volumes of this size. I have therefore pruned his story of repetitions and digressions, among other things, cutting away his scoldings of Gomara and the other chroniclers, and his frequent lists of men, horses, weapons, and provisions, which hold up the story. Where the omitted chapters contain facts essential to the understanding of events, I have given a brief account of them in italics, and I have ended my translation with Bernal Díaz's reflections on the capture of the Aztec capital. The rest can be read by those who wish to know the tale of Cortes's later campaigns and final triumph in W.H. Prescott's classic, The Conquest of Mexico. In writing his immortal history 120 years ago, Prescott borrowed freely from Bernal Díaz, whom he praised in terms on which I could not hope to improve. Bernal Díaz, the untutored child of nature, is a most true and literal copyist of nature. He transfers the scenes of real life by a sort of daguerreotype process, if I may so say, to his pages. He is among chroniclers what Defoe is among novelists. He introduces us into the heart of the camp. We huddle around the bivouac with the soldiers, loiter with them on their wearisome marches, listen to their stories, their murmurs of discontent, their plans of conquest, their hopes, their triumphs, their disappointments. All the picturesque scenes and romantic incidents of the campaign are reflected in his page as in a mirror. The lapse of 50 years has no power over the spirit of the veteran. The fire of youth glows in every line of his rude history. And as he calls up the scenes of the past, the remembrance of the brave companions who are gone gives, it may be, a warmer coloring to the picture than if it had been made at an earlier period. Time and reflection and the apprehensions for the future which might steal over the evening of life have no power over the settling opinions of his earlier days. He has no misgivings as to the right of conquest or as to the justice of the severities inflicted on the natives. He is still the soldier of the cross, and those who fell by his side in the fight were martyrs for the faith. Where are now my companions, he asks. They have fallen in battle or have been devoured by the cannibal, or been thrown to fatten the wild beast in their cages. They, whose remains should rather have been gathered under monuments emblazoned with their achievements, which deserve to be commemorated in letters of gold, for they died in the service of God and his majesty, and to give light to those who sat in the darkness, and also to acquire that wealth which most men covet. The last motive, thus tardily and incidentally expressed, may be thought by some to furnish a better key than either of the preceding to the conduct of the conquerors. It is at all events a specimen of that naivete which gives an irresistible charm to the old chronicler, and which, in spite of himself, unlocks his bosom as it were, and lays it open to the eye of the reader. It is not surprising that an American Protestant should suspect the honesty of the Spaniards' crusading spirit, notwithstanding the horrible decadence of the Aztec religion, the deeds of the conquerors, which include massacre, torture, and forcible conversion, were not by 19th century standards very much better. Yet, as one reads Bernal Díaz, one credits him and his comrades with a true sense of mission. One sees that by their own standards they were often behaving with moderation. On several occasions, the Mer Mercedarian friar Bernal Díaz seems to have forgotten his name, urges Cortes to restrain his proselytizing zeal, and it must not be forgotten, as Prescott points out, that disbelief in Christianity, whether by conviction or from ignorance, was in that age punishable by burning. About the heroism of the Spaniards there can be no two opinions. The risks they took were enormous, since their superiority in weapons was often cancelled by lack of powder and by the inability of their cavalry to maneuver. As for Bernal Díaz's attitude to Cortes, I can only endorse Prescott's opinion that he endeavors to adjust the true balance between his pretensions and those of his followers, and while he freely exposes his cunning of cupidity and sometimes his cruelty, he does ample justice to his great and heroic qualities. The same may be said of Bernal Díaz's characterization of the other Spanish captains, of the chiefs of various indigenous and Indian nations, and of many less important members of the Spanish expedition. His portrait of Montezuma aptly reveals the Aztec ruler's divided mind, and the very real quality of nobility and generosity for which the Spaniards came to respect and even love him. His successor, Guatemoc, too, is shown as a brave man and a dignified leader, whose last defense of his capital earned his enemies admiration, which, however, did not prevent them from torturing him and finally executing him for allegedly encouraging a revolt among the conquered Aztecs. Their Caracues, the Spaniards' early enemies, who afterwards became their allies, stand out as individuals, as do also the Spanish captains. Pedro de Alvarado, Pedro de Alvarado, Cristobal de Olido, whose final rebellion and cruel execution by Cortez falls outside the scope of this narrative. Andre de Tapia and Alonso de Avila. The fate of the last named captain provides a note of heavy irony at the expense of the whole story of the Spaniards' search for gold. He was captured by a French privateer on his way back to Spain with the Royal Fifth, which was in fact the major part of the booty. So the much disputed spoils of Montezuma's empire finally arrived in the treasury of his most Christian Majesty of France. The only satisfaction which the Spaniards obtained was that they finally captured and executed the French pirate. For all the roughness of his style, Bernal Díaz could sometimes be picturesque. How graphically he calls up the moment in which the Spaniards first saw from the summit of the Sierra de Arhuaco, the Valley of Mexico, with its lakes and lakeside towns, its maize fields and stone causeways, and the distant towers of the capital itself, riding like a stone Venice on the water, like a second Venice on the water. But his writing is generally on a more pedestrian level. His narrative is not skillful, and his choice of words is restricted. Often he gossips, and often he resorts to clumsy tricks of style. But however much we may criticize his history, quotes, it will, in Prescott's words, be read and reread by the scholar and the schoolboy, while the compositions of more classic chroniclers, of Gomara, for instance, who wrote briefly in a polished style, sleep undisturbed on their shelves. For Bernal Díaz was singularly free from the temptations to pervert his story in the interest of affections or feuds of personal vanity. To have marched with Cortez was for him sufficient glory. He did not need to increase his reputation or self-esteem by tricks of the pen. Taking as my authoritative text the edition of Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España of Joaquín Ramírez Cabañas, 5th edition, editorial Porogua, 1960, I have translated the greater part of Bernal Díaz's first 157 chapters, omitting only certain extraneous incidents, which I have in some cases briefly summarized, and the very frequent repetitions which mar his narrative. Ignoring his chapter divisions, which are uneven and arbitrary, I have given each campaign or principal incident a separate section. As for the names of persons and places, I have departed from Bernal Díaz's often haphazard transliterations in favor of those most familiar either from Prescott's narrative or from present-day maps of the country. Where Bernal Díaz was in actual error as to a locality or a date, I have generally corrected him in a footnote based on the observations of Señor Ramírez Cabañas or some equally reputable scholar. Any reader who wishes to know the subsequent story of Mexico cannot do better, as I have said, than turn to Prescott, who, for all his inevitable bias against Catholic and Aztec alike, wrote a first-rate narrative based on the best authorities he knew, and chief among them on Bernal Díaz himself, who now for the first time is able to tell his own story to a wide English-reading public. Of previous translations, that of A.P. Maudsley is the best, printed for the Huckleat Society in 1908. It is complete, fully documented. It is, however, ungainly in style and to be found only in a few libraries. The Life of Bernal Díaz by R.B. Cunningham Graham. That's a hell of a name. It is in effect a resume of the history made by an able writer who was an enthusiast for the deeds of the conquistadors. It is most valuable when its author allows Bernal Díaz to speak for himself, but hardly a substitute for his history. Recent years have seen a great development in our knowledge of early Mexican civilizations, of which the Spaniards found relics among the Toltecs of Chalua, but which was in a general state of decadence, especially among the savage Aztecs, who had only recently conquered the Valley of Mexico. An able account of the thoughts and religion of early Mexico is given by Lauretet Sejourné in Burning Water, Thames and Hudson, 1957, and a study of the poetry and symbolism of the Aztecs and the predecessors provided by Irene Nicholson's Firefly in the Night, Faber and Faber, 1959. JMC, London, May 1963.